Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Can you hear me in the back there okay? Yes, thank you. So welcome. My name is Kevin McLaughlin. I'm the Dean of the Faculty here at Brown. I'm also a faculty member in the departments of English, Comparative Literature, and German Studies. I'd like to welcome you to this conference, which is really an inaugural conference that's part of the launch of a new series, a new initiative on modern languages at Brown. Before turning things over to my colleague Jane Sokolowski, let me take a minute to say a word about the initiative, since some of you may not be familiar with it, and then to offer a few brief general remarks by way of introduction and welcome. The study of language and the learning of foreign languages have been fundamental to higher education since the founding of the university as an institution in medieval Europe. Greek and Latin were understood in the medieval university as sources of wisdom and knowledge essential to human existence. This humanist view of ancient languages was extended during the Enlightenment and in the 19th century to languages in general as singular modes of human communication and knowledge. Modern language study is vital to preserving the ethos of critical reflection and clarity of thought that marks the well-educated person. By announcing this initiative, we are reaffirming the importance of this perspective on languages at Brown and also committing ourselves to supporting language learning at the university and to encouraging students to learn languages and to think about language while they're here. In broad terms, this is a three-pronged initiative. First, establishing a reimagined Center for Language Studies as a hub for pedagogical innovation and interdisciplinary scholarship in modern languages under the leadership of Professor Jane Sokolowski. Thank you, Jane. Two, enhancing our capacity to support the expansion of scholarship and language study. And three, strengthening doctoral education in modern languages, training the next generation of modern language scholars and instructors. The topic selected for our first, as we've come to call it, MLab, Modern Languages at Brown conference, translation, was intended to focus on the interaction between languages and with the foreignness and on the foreignness of languages to one another. On one level, translation describes the act by which the referential or empirical dimension of one language is carried over or transferred to another one. However, as we know, languages are not only empirical. In fact, they might not be empirical at all. There is an aspect of language, that goes beyond the empirical and that goes beyond the transfer of the meaning of one language to the other. In this sense, translation involves a confrontation with something in language, if we could put it that way, that is not subject to empirical transfer, a certain irreducible otherness in language. Translation, it seems to me, involves not only transferring from one language to another, but of pondering and respecting the authority of what can't be transferred. The university must cultivate and make room for both of these aspects of translation, the ability to translate languages and also the ability to be open to the study of what cannot be translated. This is one of the tasks, and not the only one, that the Brown Language Initiative hopes to promote. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleague, Jane Sokolowski.
Hi, everybody. I am Jane Sokolowski. I'm a faculty member in German Studies and the director of Brown Center for Language Studies, as you've already heard. First of all, I want to point out that it was actually Dean McLaughlin's idea for this conference. It was his wish to strengthen the presence of languages on campus and the visibility of languages on campus. He was the one who suggested organizing a conference that was based on and about translation. It was an event that is meant to bring together so many of Brown's departments, for which languages play a significant and a fundamental role. We're truly thankful and grateful that you had this idea and that you're able to give us the support to make it happen. So here we are today, Lower Solomon, seats 225. We're almost there. And we're at the keynote address for the Translation Across Disciplines Modern Languages Conference. And this brings together 16 different departments and centers and institutes on campus. 16, that's a pretty big number. That clearly highlights the significance of languages at Brown here on our campus. 16. It was hard to fit all of those names on our conference poster, but we did it. Okay. The Center for Language Studies was asked to organize this conference, I think because we're the unit on campus that's responsible or supposed to, is charged with supporting the teaching of learning of all languages on campus. And because this is my affiliation, and we are at the Center for Language Studies all about teaching and learning, and translation is only possible if one's thoughts and ideas can move back and forth between languages, I'm going to take my 2 minutes to invite each of you here in the audience to continue learning a language you once learned or to start a new one. And for those undergraduates who are out there, those Brown-affiliated folks, take the plunge and enroll in one of our many and excellent language courses here on campus, because you need to sit down with others in a class in the shared experience of co-creating meaning out of language 3 or 4 times a week for 3.5 months for a semester. And only in doing that will you be able to grasp the language and be able to speak and understand the languages. But just knowing the language isn't enough. It isn't enough to master the language, if that's even possible, and become proficient. It's not enough to be able to do the type of translation or interpretation that we're going to bear witness to today and tomorrow at our conference. In order to truly know a language, you have to know the language and the culture. So if you come to any one of our classes, you'll see the topics that are always part of our classes. You'll see that we include history and politics and business and fashion and literature and cuisine and traditions and holidays. Do you know how to say leap year in the language that you've learned? Yeah, I hope so. If not, you gotta learn. And this whole thing about learning, there's a German word, it's a German verb, and the verb is pflegen. P-F-L-E-G-E-N, pflegen. And it means to take care of. It's the word for nurse, someone who takes care of the sick. It's the word for the home where you put your elderly when they need to be taken care of. It's the word to take care of your skin, to make it smoother, to make it prettier, to make it nicer. But it's also the word used for language. Dein Deutsch pflegen, die Sprache pflegen. And so I hope that you are also able to take care of your language, whether it's a new language that you're going to start because I just suggested that you do it, or maybe it's a language that, I learned German, I learned Spanish back then in college, and I should really keep up with that language. I should pflegen that language. It's as if the language is something that we need to take care of. Right? We must treat it carefully and tenderly. We may never forget it because we always want to make it better. And I hope that in the next day and a half, when you're at this conference, that you gain a greater understanding of languages. And I hope that you always remember to take care of your language in the German meaning of the phrase. For me right now, I need to take care of all the people who helped to make this happen. So I thank you very much to everyone who made the conference possible by suggesting a colleague or sharing an idea, participating in an event, or giving us some financial help with everything. A special thank you goes out to Sawako Nayasaku, who's right there, and to Kusei Atabi, the co-organizers, the two with the ideas and the connections, the two who were always present at the meetings, either in person or virtually, the two who received, and more importantly answered, my many emails over the last 5 months. I also would like to thank the staff who's here. We've got Jovi and her media team all around. There's Jen Charette up in the back from Conference Services, and my folks from the Center for Language Studies, Chelsea Timlin, Alana Saplito, and Jill Stewart. I thank everyone very much for making this all possible. So without further ado, I pass the mic on to Massimo, who's a professor of Italian studies, who was very instrumental in getting our keynote speaker here. Thank you, Massimo.
Buon pomeriggio, benvenuti. So it is a great pleasure for me to introduce acclaimed translator and editor Anne Goldstein. When Jane and I first brainstormed about potential keynote speakers for our conference, Anne Goldstein's name immediately came to mind. Not only is she perhaps the most prominent translator of Italian today, but her career as a translator also illustrates the predicament of the translator as a voice, and in her case, alter ego of the writer in another language. First, a quick biographical sketch. Anne Goldstein graduated from Bennington College, worked at Esquire, and became head of the New Yorker's copy department by day and translator from Italian by night in the 1990s. The story goes that she picked up Italian through an after-hours language class in hopes of reading Dante's Divine Comedy, a desire tracing back to her days as a literature major at Bennington College. In a few years, she learned the language so well that in 1994, her translation of Aldo Buzzi's short story collection, Journey to the Land of the Flies, received the Pen Renato Poggioli Prize. Poggioli, an acclaimed great literary critic, an Italian expatriate to this country, and himself an acclaimed translator from Russian into Italian, taught here at Brown very briefly in the early 1940s. Over her prolific career as a translator, Goldstein has given Anglophone readers the disparate voices of Pierpaolo Pasolini, Italo Calvino, Primo Levi, Alessandro Baricco, and Elena Ferrante, among others, while spending her day sharpening the prose of John Updike, Janet Malcolm, and Adam Gopnik for the New York. Primo Levi and Elena Ferrante are, of course, the two very different authors most associated with her name as a translator. In 2004, she became an editor of the Levi Project, the publication of Levi's complete oeuvre, published in 2015, with the goal of giving readers a consistent voice for an author who had been translated at different times by different translators. Among the works she herself translated, brilliantly, I might add, is one of Levi's most challenging works and one of my own favorites, The Periodic Table, a sort of autobiography in 21 chemical elements, each a metaphorical emblem of various episodes in Levi's life. Levi, of course, was trained as a chemist. Speaking of the task of the translator and the experience of being translated, Levi, who of course knew something about the art of survival through language, once famously wrote, "Those who exercise the trade of translator, of interpreter, should feel honored because they exert themselves to limit the damage of the curse of Babel. The translator," Levi also added, "is the only one to really read the text, to read it in depth, in all its nuances, weighing and appreciating every word and every image, or perhaps detecting voids and untruths." And Levi also compared being translated to a semi-passive state similar to that of a patient on a surgeon's operating table or on the psychoanalyst's couch, which would make the translator, of course, part surgeon and part psychoanalyst. Sometimes, as in Anne Goldstein's case, the translator can find themselves in an unexpected and paradoxical position, particularly for one who tries to disappear into the text she is translating like a ventriloquist. We need only look to Goldstein's translations of Elena Ferrante, the most popular anonymous Italian writer in the world today, whose success made Goldstein, if not the face, then the de facto spokesperson for the author in the English world. More recently, she translated Jhumpa Lahiri's meditation on her relationship to the Italian language, entitled In Other Words, written originally in Italian. Translating into English an author who usually writes in English and revising the translation together, as I understand, is another formidable challenge that Anne has faced. As you can see, there is no more qualified person in my mind to talk about the task, the craft, the curse, and the blessing of the translator than Anne Goldstein. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Massimo. That was very nice. I hope I don't repeat too much of what you said. And thank you all for coming. Primo Levi was deported to Auschwitz in February of 1944. One of the first things that he realized upon arriving in the concentration camp was how crucial language can be. Even his rudimentary German, his ability to grasp orders that, if not followed, could lead to death, gave him an advantage. And in his first book, If This Is a Man, he uses the image of the Tower of Babel, the inability of men to understand one another, the destruction of language, to represent one of the ways in which the Nazis destroyed the humanity of their prisoners. At another extreme of language is the child Herbenek of Levi's second book, The Truce, encountered in a makeshift Russian hospital after the collapse of Auschwitz. Herbenek, as Levi writes, a nothing, a child of death, a child of Auschwitz, has no language, yet is desperate to speak. And Levi goes on, his eyes, lost in his pinched triangular face, flashed, terribly alive, full of demand, of insistence, of the will to be released, to shatter the tomb of his muteness. The speech that he lacked, that no one had taken care of teaching him, the need for speech, persisted in his gaze with explosive urgency. Herbenek dies. In the end, he is able to utter only one incomprehensible sound, and it is only through Levi's words that he speaks, that he exists. These examples may be extreme, but they testify to the existential importance that language can have, and by extension, to the crucial role of the translator. How to get the text right, how to convey words, meaning, tone, style. In the case of a writer like Levi, with his passion and care for precision and concision, for the right word, the prospect of translation may seem daunting, is daunting. But these are questions that the translator faces with every author and in any language. I hope to hint at some answers to the larger issues by talking in a practical way about my own process. Like many translators, I began translating almost by accident. For me, it was a way of studying Italian more closely and intimately. It is true that I learned Italian at the New Yorker in a class in which we studied Italian for a year and then we read Dante. It was a pretty bold move, but it was great. It was a way of studying Italian more closely and intimately, from the inside, so to speak. I had been studying Italian for about 5 years and undertook my first translation on my own as a challenge to myself, a kind of exercise. The work fascinated and absorbed me, and then the translation was published, entitled Chekhov in Sondrio, which is a part of Journey to the Land of the Flies. It was a kind of memoir reflection about Italy and Russian literature by a little-known writer named Aldo Buzzi. So I came to translation by this not only accidental but somewhat informal route, rather than by formal academic study of the literature or through day-to-day life in Italy. Since that first translation, I've translated a wide variety of Italian writers, some famous and some, like Buzzi, not well known even to Italians. In part, perhaps because of that route, as a translator, I tend to stick quite closely to the text. I don't feel that my job is to improve or elaborate on what an author has written, or to explain or comment on it. In general, I prefer not to create something equivalent, such as translate an Italian dialect into a regional American dialect or accent, a Southern accent, for example, or a Brooklyn accent, or 20s gangster slang. I will return to the subject of dialect later. I was once asked if there were passages where you need to be creative because the Italian idiom doesn't easily translate into English. My answer is that I try very hard to find a solution without being too creative. Naturally, there are situations where you have to depart from the text, but my aim is not to go too far, to remain within the limits of faithfulness, which is admittedly perhaps a subjective standard. When I start a translation, I usually make a fairly rapid first draft of the whole book. Often at this stage, I put in several alternatives for a word or phrase, but I always leave the literal translation, even if I'm almost certain that I'll change it in the end. I look up words in the dictionary, or rather dictionaries, even words I know, because I always find nuances, synonyms that might turn out to be useful when I make a final choice. The writer, of course, can choose in his language a single word that includes several meanings, connotations, nuances, degrees, or shades of meaning. The translator, on the other hand, eventually has to decide which meaning, or even which set of nuances, is most important. It's unlikely that the target language has a single word that contains all the meanings and connotations of the word in the original text. Anyway, at this stage, I don't spend a lot of time or effort refining words or thoughts or ideas, or trying to figure out passages that are tricky or that I have doubts or questions about. I usually make a list of problematic words and expressions. In the second draft, I try to solve most of the bigger problems of meaning and sense, but there will unquestionably still be many doubts to resolve and word choices and refinements to be made. Although I work on the computer, at a certain point, usually after the second or third draft, I print out the manuscript and read it on paper, because you always see things on paper that you might not see on the screen. Awkward or unintended repetitions, for example, punctuation tangles, other sorts of rough passages. In fact, I spent most of my career working on paper, and its value can't be overestimated. I actually know one translator from Czech who prints his manuscript in the type and dimension of the book, so he can really see what the translation is going to look like and how it will read in the actual formal layout. As I said, I use several dictionaries of various types, both paper and online. Italian-English, Italian-Italian, English, dictionaries of slang, of idiomatic expressions, synonym dictionaries in both languages, and so on. For Pasolini's Street Kids, which is full of Roman dialect, I had a Romanesco Italian dictionary. And in fact, the Italian novel itself has a Romanesco Italian glossary. The internet, of course, is an amazing resource and is always expanding. You can find specialized dictionaries such as Piedmontese or Neapolitan, which were useful for Levi and Elena Ferrante, or etymological, historical vocabularies, all kinds of useful information such as maps, botanical and zoological information and names, the components of the type of shutter that rolls down over a shop window, the parts of a door lock, which not only are not exactly the same in the two languages, but are somewhat technical. In the case of Levi, I was able to find on the internet the equipment used in a chemistry lab, including pictures. At the end of The Story of a New Name, the second of Ferrante's Neapolitan novels, there's a scene in a sausage factory, and I was able to find certain details of sausage making. And of course, I consult native Italian speakers, who, however, don't necessarily agree with one another. And in the case of dialect, likely don't know the dialect of a region of Italy that isn't their own. After all the drafts, after the struggle to arrive at the right word, I think it's important to return to the original text, to be sure of not having strayed too far, and to be sure as well of having understood the meaning not only of the words, but of the entire passage, of the words in their context, of the word in the phrase, in the sentence, in the paragraph. One of the ways in which the translator is able to convey style so that his or her translations of Primo Levi do not sound like his or her translations of Elena Ferrante or Pier Paolo Pasolini or Alessandro Baricco is, I think, that attentiveness to the original text. Here are three examples of different writers, which I hope will illustrate this. The first passage is from a book called Mr. Gwyn by Alessandro Baricco, published in 2012. She went to Jasper Gwyn's studio on the Underground, but she always got out one stop earlier to walk a little before going in. On the street, she turned the key over and over in her hand, and that was her way of starting work. And this is from Pasolini's Street Kids, published in 1955. Ricetto felt annoying inside, right in the middle, and decided to skip out on them all. He left through the empty church, but at the door he ran into his godfather, who said, "Hey, where are you going?" "Home," said Ricetto, "I'm hungry." "You're coming to my house, you bastard," his godfather shouted after him. "There's the lunch." But Ricetto paid no attention and ran off over the sun-baked asphalt. All Rome was a single roar. Only up on the hill was there silence, but it was charged like a mine. And this is a sentence from Anna Maria Ortese from her book Il mare non bagna Napoli, which was translated into English as Neapolitan Chronicles for various reasons. This is from the story The Involuntary City. Actually, it's not a story, it's a piece of reportage, I guess. Anyway, a small woman, completely bloated like a dying bird, her black hair cascading over a hunchback, and with a lemon-colored face dominated by a large pointed nose that hung over a hair lip, was combing her hair in front of a fragment of mirror, holding some hairpins between her teeth. Among the general difficulties in translating from Italian, or I guess any Romance language, into English, is the fact that English nouns don't have genders, and so a modifier has to stay close to its noun. This means that English syntax is less flexible than Italian, and the English sentence can't always follow the Italian structure. This is a sentence from Barrico's La sposa giovane, the young bride. Morti la voce del vecchio li riporta in vita, which reads literally, dead, the voice of the old man brings them back to life. In English, there's no way to know what dead modifies. In Italian, it's immediately clear from the masculine plural ending e that it modifies the masculine plural noun or pronoun later in the sentence, not the voice or the old man. My solution here was to make, in essence, two sentences. They are dead. The old man's voice returns them to life. Of course, you might object that something is lost by not having dead be the first word of the English sentence. Someone once criticized a sentence I had translated because it didn't end on the same word as the Italian, and therefore a particular emphasis was lost. But doing so would have produced an English sentence that to me seemed tortured. For example, in Italian, it's completely natural to write la lentezza con cui sarebbe risalita in superficie una qualche verità. Literally, the slowness with which would rise to the surface some sort of truth, thus ending on the important word, truth. You would certainly come up with a less literal or word-for-word English, such as how slowly some sort of truth would rise to the surface. But, as with the Barrico sentence that does not begin with dead, it involves a betrayal of another element of the sentence. And I'm sure everybody here knows traduttore, traditore. Thus, the translator is constantly having to balance the requirements of emphasis and style in the original text with the requirements of his own language. As in the previous example, where would rise precedes truth, in Italian, the verb often precedes the subject and can also be followed by numerous and complex subjects, whereas in English, the subject generally comes first. In addition, in Italian, the verb form alone indicates both number and person. Here's a sentence from the 20th century Florentine writer Romano Bilenchi. Quasi drammatici mi apparivano il brusco risveglio, il racconto della nonna, il nonno così tranquillo appoggiato al guanciale. Literally, almost dramatic seemed to me the abrupt awakening, grandmother's story, grandfather so calmly leaning against the pillow. Here the verb apparivano, seemed, is followed by three different subjects, the last of which has a string of modifiers of its own. The fact that there will be multiple subjects is signaled both by the plural ending of the adjective, that is, the second word dramatic, and by the third person plural form of the verb. Italian verbs not only indicate person and number, but also contain the personal pronoun. So in Italian, you could say vengo e va, I come and he goes. Whereas in English, except in a series of verbs with the same subject, I came, saw, and conquered, the personal pronoun has to be stated. In Ferrante's children's book, The Beach at Night, there are a number of objects that are characters: the big rake, fire, the wave. In Italian, when these characters act or speak, they don't need pronouns. The reader is free to imagine them as he or it or she. For instance, in Italian, referring to the fire, we read simply scoppietta. It, he, she sputters. In the end, I decided to use personal pronouns rather than it, even though in a sense it makes the personhood of the object characters more emphatic. Another particular feature of Italian is that words can take on shades of meaning with the addition of suffixes, such as isimo, one, ella, ina. For example, a person who is allegro, cheerful, can become allegrissimo, very cheerful. In 2 consecutive sentences in Ferrante, we find benissimo, eccitatissime, and nerissima. Whereas in Italian, there's a kind of light emphasis in each word that moves the sentences along. If in English you repeated very or some other intensifying adverb each time, the effect would be leaden. So it can be difficult to preserve the sensation without using too many words. Or to take another example from Ferrante, the sentence, tesessime procedemmo, literally, very tense we proceeded. For the word tesessime, the superlative of teso, tense, modifying we, the unstated subject of the verb, there were many possibilities. Very tense, extremely nervous, edgy, anxious, and so on. The Italian word tesessime is an adjective, but because in English adjectives don't generally modify pronouns, you'd have that somewhat awkward, very tense we proceeded. Not impossible, but awkward precisely in a way that the Italian is not. In the end, I decided to make the word an adverb, which creates a more natural sentence in English, as the adjective is normal in Italian. And I decided to use the word apprehensively, which seemed to combine the ideas of tension and nervousness and give some hint of the intensification of the very. And in the end, actually, it was a more complicated situation, but basically it was apprehensively we kept going. For a different type of solution, you could look at the word strada, street, which can be modified to become a stradina, a small or narrow street, or a stradone, a big street. In the Neapolitan novels, there's a stradone that is an important part of the neighborhood where most of the story takes place. After considering big street, large street, wide street, avenue, boulevard, even Broadway, and so on, I decided to define the stradone at the first mention and then to leave the word in Italian. It seemed to me that the other solutions didn't have the right tone or would have become clumsy. Contrarily, the word rione, neighborhood, which also represents an important place and symbol in these novels, I did translate into the perhaps slightly less specific English neighborhood. Another practical difficulty faced by the translator is references and allusions that would be immediately understood by the reader in the original language. There are various types, literary, cultural, historical, geographical, and various solutions. Add a footnote or endnote, try to explain by means of the translation, or not explain at all, leaving it to the reader and Google, of course. One of the main categories of reference is literary. And in the case of Levi, the most important is surely Dante. Sometimes, naturally, Levi himself signals the reference, as in the canto of Ulysses chapter of If This Is a Man, which is essentially made up of quotations from Canto 26 of the Inferno. At other times, however, he quotes Dante without saying that it's Dante, and the reader has to understand on his own. At the end of the first chapter of If This Is a Man, he writes, "Guai a voi, anime prave, woe unto you, wicked souls," which is a reference to Canto 3 of the Inferno. Here, I decided to add a footnote. Sometimes an explanation can be included in the translation, especially when it comes to literary historical figures. Where Levi can mention Agnolo Beolco, the translation adds the Renaissance playwright Agnolo Beolco. In the context, it doesn't interfere. In an unusual reversal, Levi, in his poem Pius, uses the Yiddish expression oi gewalt, oh God, woe is me, familiar certainly to most Americans, whereas the Italian has a footnote to explain the meaning. It's actually Levi's footnote. And in the end, we decided to leave the footnote with an indication that it's Levi's own note and not the editor's. But in a similarly unusual reversal, Alessandro Piperno's 2005 novel, The Worst Intentions, has references to Jewish rites and practices that in the original all have footnotes, but in English didn't need them, like Kaddish and various other things. Another category includes historical facts that may need to be explained. For example, the American reader is unlikely to know the significance of September 8, 1943, the date Italy surrendered to the Allies and the Germans took possession of northern and central Italy. There are several references in Levi's works. In one place, the author himself explains. In another, I added a footnote. Ferrante's Neapolitan novels, which cover decades of Italian history, contain references to the Red Brigades, the kidnapping of Prime Minister Aldo Moro, the MSI, or the Italian Social Movement Party, and so on. In a novel, I think it's generally better to try to get around using a footnote, although I have various colleagues who disagree, who love footnotes. And I thought that the first two examples, the Red Brigades and Aldo Moro, could stand on their own. In the case of the MSI, I added the word neo-fascist, the neo-fascist Italian Social Movement Party. Another category of references is details of geographical and topographical places. In Levy's Turin, there is the Valentino Park, the Mole Antonelliana, Piazza della Crocetta. In the chapter Potassium of the periodic table, he writes, "Gusts of cold fog rising from the Valentino overtook me. Here I decided to add the word park." There's also a reference to the Valentino in the first few pages of Ferrante's The Days of Abandonment. And again, I could easily have added the word park. In this instance, I didn't, since it seemed pretty clear in the context. In autumn, you could see the green of the Valentino grow yellow or red. For the translator, it's helpful to have a picture of what the writing is referring to, because the dictionary, that is, pure vocabulary, doesn't always provide the right word. Here, Google Street View is a great resource. And even if you don't use the details of a place in the translation, it's useful to have an idea, an image that gives some knowledge, not only of what the place looks like, but of what it may represent. In the Neapolitan novels, Michele Solara moves to a house in Posillipo, an area of Naples. I had spent some time there and had a picture of it in my mind as a beautiful place on a cliff above the sea with villas and views. I also thus had an idea of what it represented as a move into another world for the Solaras, even if I didn't literally use that knowledge in the translation. One fairly common category of references is those having to do with school. The Italian grading system uses numbers rather than letters, but instead of translating them into R, A, B, C, and so forth, I've usually preferred to be descriptive, as in a poor grade, a high grade, and so forth. When Levy writes, Primo Levi received a degree in chemistry con 110 e lode, literally 110 and praise, there's no need to explain to an Italian that this is a top grade. Possible English versions might be a first-class degree, chemistry degree with top honors, degree magna cum laude. The final version reads degree in chemistry with honors. I've usually preferred this, but not always. In the Neapolitan novels, especially My Brilliant Friend, where school marks play a large role, I decided to leave the 1 to 10 grading system of the Italian, and at the first mention of grades, where Elena, telling us her and Lila's final elementary school mark, says, "I passed with all 10s," I added the words "the highest marks." I don't think it's intrusive, and when grades come up again, as they do frequently in this volume, the reader has a context. These examples point to a more general question of tone and style. The translator is verbally conveying a text from one language to another, but as I said earlier, he is not trying, or I'm not anyway, trying to create something equivalent. That is, Levy is writing about a particular place and a particular time, and it would be jarring to impose a different school or grading system. Similarly, Ferrante's novels are set in a particular place and at a particular time, and for a Neapolitan shoemaker to speak in a Brooklyn accent, or the child Lenu to say that on her report card she got all A's, would jolt the reader out of the place and the time, out of the reality of the novel. Every writer obviously has his or her own style. And so for the translator, his or her particular difficulties. Giacomo Leopardi qualifies, modifies, adds, exemplifies, limits, and expands meaning, as if every sentence were a laboratory of working toward precision. Anna Maria Ortese constructs elaborate, sometimes surreal metaphors. Pasolini has his own version of Roman dialect. Ferrante's sentences are dense, often urgent, wanting to get somewhere. I'm going to talk in a little more detail about some of the problems in translating Levy and Ferrante, as the writers that I've spent the most time with. In the case of Levy, one has to be perhaps most attentive not to be led astray by the necessary focus on the exactness of particular words. The sentence structure can be complex, but at the same time, the sentences are compact, precise, and balanced. This sentence from the chapter Hydrogen in the periodic table contains an entire education, from the ignorant boy climbing a tree to the chemist or scientist trained to understand the natural world. The subject is hands. They knew the convulsive grip of the branch of a tree because we loved to climb out of a natural desire and at the same time, for Enrico and me, a confused homage and return to the origin of the species. But they didn't know the solemn, balanced weight of the hammer, the concentrated force of blades, which had been too prudently forbidden, the eloquent texture of wood, the similar yet different malleability of iron, lead, and copper. Then there's the science, including not just technical terms, but descriptions of intricate biological, chemical, or engineering processes or operations. In the case of the technical and scientific terms, the translator has to be sure of the correct English term, which may not be the dictionary term. In the essay Asymmetry in Life, Levy writes of the way in which a sequence of amino acids can agomitolarsi. The dictionary definition is curl up or roll itself up, whereas the correct term for what a sequence of amino acids, a protein, does in English, a scientist friend told me, is fold. Even when the subject is not explicitly scientific, there is an exactness of description and language that we associate with science and that can be hard to get right and readable. When the creature-like poem of the story The Fugitive is examined under the microscope, Levy writes, "Tiny hairs were sticking out from the page, corresponding to attributes of the letters on the other side. In particular, the extremities stuck out, the legs of the D's and P's, the little legs of the N's. The creatures in the story TV fans from Delta Sep tell us, we have 10 armpits. We are all built according to decadal symmetries so that our length is the golden section of our radius." And then many of Levy's stories have words that are not necessarily scientific or technological, but which are unusual or even made up, such as dysphylaxis, the opposite of prophylaxis, and knall, spelled K-N-A-L-L, and defined as a small, smooth cylinder, as long and thick as a Toscano cigar and not much heavier. There are also essays that are specific. Levy's stories, by the way, are amazing, and they deserve to be better known. There are also essays that are specifically about words or language, where the translator has to decide how much to explain and what to leave to the reader. I think that some of these stories were excluded from earlier collections of Levy's works in English for that very reason. The essay Leggere la vita, and here the title was left in Italian, is about the derivation of a phrase, leggere la vita, that means to gossip, and in it, Levy quotes sources in several languages. In the Argon chapter of the periodic table, which on one level is about language, Levy translates the phrases and words in the Jewish Piedmontese dialect into Italian. I translated them into English only, so the reader misses seeing the relationship of the dialect to the language, but I thought it would have been too cumbersome to have both. In If This Is a Man, the various phrases in German and French were left untranslated, as in the original, in order to maintain the crucial sensation of the babel of languages. Finally, there's the language that is literally untranslatable, as in the story Dizzying Heat, whose protagonist can't stop making palindromes. Needless to say, I didn't try to make equivalents. To give you an idea of what might go into the translation of a sentence, here's the first clause of a sentence near the beginning of the truce. Così per noi anche l'ora della libertà suonò grave e chiusa. Word for word, the sentence reads, so for us, even the hour of liberty sounded grave and closed. In this case, the syntax is straightforward. In the second version, I changed liberty to freedom, as perhaps more natural in English when speaking of the release of men who have been prisoners. And keep in mind, as I'm sure all of you probably as translators are trying to be translators know, I mean, all these choices and reasonings are personal, subjective, and even opportunistic. I mean, I might have a different idea myself on a different day. Anyway, then I changed sounded to struck, because it seemed to me that the connotation of a clock, of the hour that strikes or chimes, was important. So for us, even the hour of freedom struck. And then came the two adjectives. Grave could be heavy or serious or solemn or deep, as in a deep sound. And although I thought there was something physical implied, the tolling of a clock tower bell, heavy, or in a pair, heavy and closed, seemed perhaps too physical. But then I considered it in combination with solemn, which gives the sense of a ceremonial moment, formal and serious, solemn and heavy. But again, heavy seemed too limited. nor did I like the sound of solemn and heavy. Going back to the Italian, chiusa, I had the idea that these men are no longer closed, but feel closed, and oppressive, while perhaps a bit of a leap, seemed to me to convey the idea of both physical and spiritual heaviness, of the men and of the moment. So for us, even the hour of freedom struck solemn and oppressive. In this brief example, I've barely mentioned sound and rhythm, but certainly they are a factor in the use and choice of words in a translation, of greater or lesser importance depending on the text. One other element enters into the translator's final decisions, and that is the unconscious or instinct, whose role, I think, again, can't be underestimated. Or overestimated. Obviously, too, a different translator might have had different ideas, different ways of thinking about a sentence, made different choices. One of the risks of translation is that you can always be second-guessed, especially by yourself. Ferrante's style is very different. The sentences are dense. She wants to get somewhere, as I said, and she can use a lot of words, not in a redundant way, but in order to reach the precise truth of, let's say, an emotion. And then she's often describing emotional states. In a single sentence, she takes you through a range of actions and emotions. It's as if we were present at a search for truth. It can be tricky to preserve the intensity and the momentum created by the rush or pile-up of words within an English syntax and without losing the meaning. There can be almost a sense of excess that you need to hold on to without it sounding melodramatic. This style is not conventionally beautiful, especially in the context of Italian literature. Ferrante has said that beauty of style doesn't interest her. Indeed, she speaks of avoiding it because she believes that it can get in the way of truth. Many readers have pointed out her tendency to write in run-on sentences, or my tendency to write in run-on sentences. I think it's one of the ways in which she achieves that force and that intensity. And though it's true that Italian sustains such sentences more easily than English, I've tried to preserve the style as far as possible. Here in one sentence, she is capturing the character not only of her schoolmate Alfonso, but of his brother Stefano. Although his features were very similar to Stefano's, the same eyes, same nose, same mouth, although his body, as he grew, was taking the same form, the large head, legs slightly short in relation to the torso, although in his gaze and in his gestures he manifested the same mildness, I felt in him a total absence of the determination that was concealed in every cell of Stefano's body, and that in the end, I thought, reduced his courtesy to a sort of hiding place from which to jump out unexpectedly. And here is Nino talking to Elena after they've left their spouses to go together to the conference in France. But when we were alone, he made me a speech anxious in tone and passionate in content, whose sense was that I should trust him, that although our situation was complicated, we would surely untangle it, that to do so, however, we had to go home. We couldn't flee from Montpellier to Paris, and then to who knows what other city. We had to confront our spouses and begin our life together. One of the most frequently asked questions about Ferrante's style is whether she writes in dialect. And the answer is that she doesn't, or only rarely, and then usually just a word or two. When she writes in Italian, he or she said in dialect, what follows is in Italian, although since it's usually dialogue or the report of a dialogue, the language may be more colloquial anyway. Dialect is the language of the neighborhood, of home and family. It's the language of parents and children, of love, but also of violence and brutality. Italian is a language that children learn in school. But as Elena goes through school, her Italian changes. The Italian learned in elementary school is not good enough in high school, and when she gets to the university in Pisa, it's as if she had to learn to speak all over again. One of the first places where the dialect Italian division comes up is in My Brilliant Friend, when Elena and Lila climb the stairs to Don Achille's apartment to get their dolls back. Eventually, he gives them some money and tells them to go get new dolls. This conversation, we are told, with Don Achille's wife and children in the background and occasionally part of the dialogue, takes place mainly in dialect. But as the girls turn to leave, Elena, on the stairs, says a sentence in Italian, Buonasera e buon appetito. Good evening and enjoy your meal. It's as if she were already separating herself from her surroundings. She has faced the ogre, Don Achille, and survived, and she is in some sense sealing this triumph and this division with a formal statement in an elevated language. Why did Ferrante choose not to write in dialect? For one thing, many Italians might not understand it, and she talks a lot about wanting to be read, to be accessible, to make the reader want to turn the page. Another reason that has been suggested is that because it is mainly a spoken language, though in fact Neapolitan does have literature, its effectiveness would be lost on the page. Whereas in the movie of Ferrante's novel L'amore molesto, or Troubling Love, dialect is used very effectively. Parts of the correspondence between Ferrante and the filmmaker Mario Martone are published in Frantumaglia, her collection of letters and interviews. And in the TV series that was or is being made from the Neapolitan novels, the dialogue is in Neapolitan, and it was shown in Italy with Italian subtitles. So the translation of dialect is both difficult and problematic. The only way I've found to deal with it is when I've had to use to use a slangier, more colloquial diction. Italian or Neapolitan readers have said that they hear a kind of undercurrent of dialect in the supposedly dialect passages of the Neapolitan quartet, and I think that's true, if only in that the language is perhaps a bit looser, although that's not a definition of dialect, obviously. Though, as I said, it is mostly dialogue or a paraphrase in Italian of what the speaker is saying. There are Neapolitan terms like tamaro, scarparo, mappina, for which I tried to find more colloquial, if not exactly slang words or expressions. For example, with the word tamaro, I started with boor or peasant, which was anachronistic. Then I tried yokel, which seemed almost literary, whereas something like redneck seemed too specifically American. Eventually, I got to hick. Is it successful? Well, I've been told it's not crude enough. So you never know. In an essay on translation, Levi, who made a number of translations into Italian from German, enumerates some of the pitfalls in transferring a text from one language to another: idiomatic phrases, local terms, false friends. He points out that it's not enough simply to avoid the traps, that the translator's most effective weapon is a linguistic sensibility. In a note to his translation of Kafka's The Trial, he said that he had tried to find a middle course between a propensity to smooth what was rough, that is, retelling the story in, he says, a language that has nothing to do with the original, and offering a line-for-line, word-for-word transcription. He writes, "I made a determined effort to balance faithfulness to the text with the flow of expression. My goal as a translator of any writer has been to demonstrate that linguistic sensibility, maintaining a high degree of accuracy without losing the eloquence and spirit of the original. My hope is always that the margin for second guessing, especially by myself, is minimal." In a column in The Guardian, Elena Ferrante paid tribute to translators. "Thanks to translators, Italianness travels through the world, enriching it, and the world, with its many languages, passes through Italianness and modifies it. Translators transport nations into other nations. They are the first to reckon with distant modes of feeling. Translation is our salvation. It draws us out of the well in which, entirely by chance, we are born." Thank you. I guess we can have questions.
Thank you very much, Anne. I'm sure there are questions. I think that was, you took us inside your laboratory to
That was
some
the
extent,
idea.
and that's great.
That was
I
the
think,
idea.
and I confirmed, at least to me, what Levi was saying, that translators
Yeah.
are partly surgeons,
Yeah, I didn't know that
psychoanalysts,
quote.
and
Yeah.
more and more. So,
Yeah.
please. Yes, Julia.
Oh, thank you. First of all, thank you for this incredible speech. I was pouring while listening, and almost sweating. My curiosity is, in your process of becoming more and more a translator, how did you learn to navigate and understand and perceive the different registers in Italian as a foreign
Well,
native speaker?
that's one of those questions that's hard to really understand. I mean, hard to answer. Go ahead.
I'll add a little bit, because now I'm studying translations from Italian into English, and for me sometimes it's difficult to see if this register is respected or not.
I think in a way that's what Levy called linguistic sensibility, and it's just something I think that comes from reading a lot in both languages, probably. I mean, I spent most of my career as an editor and a copy editor, so I was very engaged in languages with English in a very detailed way. So I think that probably was helpful. But again, you know, it's hard.
Hi, hello. Right here.
Oh.
In the corner. Thank you for your lecture. I was very impressed with all the rewriting that you described, and I'm interested in asking you about your work as a translator, because you were also an editor, right? Mm-hmm. And how do you separate this work, or do you see that? Can you tell you're taking editorial decisions or translation decisions, and also, how is the work with the editors after you finish a translation? How is the process of getting that text to the market?
Well, first of all, to answer the second part of your question, the sad truth is that most publishers don't do that much editing of translations. Europa Editions, who publish Ferrante, among many other translations, are the mother company is an Italian company, and in Italy there is this tradition of checking translations, of having a person who knows both languages read the translation, and they've continued to do that in the books that they publish in English, and that is invaluable. But almost no other publisher that I know of does that. Another example though is New Directions. Publishes a lot of translations, and the editor there, Barbara Epler, and she's the chief. She doesn't know any other languages, but she's a very good editor of translations. So that is another publisher that edits translations. But generally, there's not that much editing done of translations. Now I forgot the first part of the question. Oh, the copy editing and editing. I mean, you know, they're sort of mutually reinforcing, I would say, to some extent. Yeah, I don't know if I can be more detailed about it.
Hello. I was curious how much at this point in your career, especially post-Ferrante, but I mean, even before the explosion of interest into her work and into Italian writers that you have translated, how much you still find authors through publishing houses in the United States, and how much do you feel free to discover authors that interest you and that you just want to bring to Anglophone readers?
I've actually, almost everything that I've done has been brought to me by a publisher, by either an American publisher or I guess you could call Europa also an American publisher. I mean, an Italian American publisher. But I haven't done that much of trying to get authors that I wanted published. But I think it's hard. You know, in the context. Although I have to say there are now a lot of small publishers that publish translations. So there are more openings in a way for bringing more places you could bring a project that you wanted to that you liked.
Hi, thank you very much for the lecture. I was thinking about your first encounter with Italian as a language, which was through Dante. So, what happened with poetry? And you were mostly like translating prose. Have you ever thought about translating poetry? And then the other question was your relationship with authors. So you were mentioning Ortese, okay, Piperno, now Ferrante. Yeah. So how is, in this particular case also, right, well, in this particular case, I guess it's impossible, like the relationship with authors that you translate?
Well, first of all, the idea of translating poetry terrifies me. So I think that's just too hard. Prose is hard enough, so I just always say that I'm not going to translate poetry. But I also have translated a lot of dead authors, so I have no relationship with the authors. And then one very reclusive author. Most of the writers that I've translated, I haven't had a close relationship with. I mean, I've been able to write to them and ask them questions that I have, but I haven't really worked with them. I mean, the one author, ironically, that I worked with the most was Aldo Buzzi. And that's one of those things where, that translators are always talking about. I mean, that it's like a curse and a blessing, because he was, the author, he was always rewriting. That was really the worst of it. He was, once his book, it was published in Italian, but it wasn't yet published in English. So he felt that he could just keep changing things. And then, there's always writers that think they know English is better than they really do know English, so it's a mixed situation.
Hi, I was wondering if you also did the translation for the HBO series, and if there was anything interesting issues around that.
I didn't. What I did was translate the screenplay. I translated the screenplays for HBO, but as I learned, the screenplays apparently are just a starting point for what happens eventually. I did the subtitles, or I edited the subtitles for the first 2 parts of the first season, but I didn't do the rest of the subtitles. But the funny thing happened was that they originally wrote the screenplays in Italian, and then they translated them into Neapolitan, so I could work from the Italian. All of a sudden, I started receiving these screenplays in Neapolitan. I was like, what? So I had a quick learning process of learning Neapolitan. But yeah, that's all. That's the only involvement that I had.
I wonder how much you feel the ownership for the things that you've translated.
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, yes, to some extent, I do feel that I do feel a kind of ownership. I mean, I feel an ownership as a translator. For example, I feel like nobody else should translate Ferrante. I'm just going to say that. Specific authors. I know a lot of translators who don't feel that way, who feel that they can share their author. I guess I do feel kind of that I own the author, if not, and so I guess in that way I own the translation as well. But I'm not the author. I do recognize the difference.
This is a related comment. I was once in a conversation with the Turkish author Orhan Pamuk, and someone asked him how he felt about the translations of his novels in the languages that he knew, especially in English, which was, it's very much his second language. And he said, I don't really care, it's not my work. It's like I have completely disowned it. Mm-hmm. So how would you feel that way about your authors, if they were to say that?
Wait, if my work was translated?
No, if the authors you have translated said that this is not, what you've done is not my work.
Well, I mean, it's a difficult question in a way. I mean, it's because I don't feel that. I mean, yes, it's true. The English sentences are my work, but the book is not my work. So I guess it's both ways. I mean, I guess you want it both ways, in some sense. I mean, I know translators are always complaining about reviewers who quote big sections of the text and say, this writing, so the author's writing, Pamuk's writing is really wonderful here, or really something even more specific. And you think, wait a second, that's not his writing.
This was fascinating. I'm just curious about your process. Do you have a productivity limit per day? How long does it take to translate one of the 4 novels, for example?
It usually takes as long as you have the deadline, as the deadline is. Or maybe as long as you can stretch the deadline. Yeah, I mean, those books were translated pretty quickly because they were on a really specific deadline. You know, they had to come out at a certain, once they started coming out, they had to come out on this deadline. So I'm as productive as I have to be, I guess.
May I ask a question about the levy, the publication of levy?
Yeah.
Because, of course, that involves also going back, revising, or perhaps changing, retranslating, so redoing the work that has been done by other translators.
That's right. Yeah.
So how was this process? Because clearly involved also your judgment about other translators, so colleague of yours, etc. What was the goal, really? To come up with a consistent voice, or there was some other consideration?
No, well, when the Levy project started out, and one of the reasons I think it was so immense and so immensely long, was that in the beginning, the Bob Weil, the editor at Norton, who had this idea, thought we could just collecting all the Levy translations and putting them together in a 1 volume, or well, 3 volumes. And when I started looking into it, I discovered, well, first of all, that the translations were of different ages, and that putting them together would seem like a little bit of a mishmash. And also, I discovered that many of the stories, well, a certain number of the stories hadn't been translated at all, and most of them had been published in English in a really haphazard way. 2 from this book, 3 from this book, let's put a few from this other book, and in an inconsistent way. So once I decided that there should be new translations of everything, then I think I decided that it was really a question of my controlling the translators. I mean, of having of trying to get one voice or one. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't mean it to sound monolithic, and I'm sure there are differences. But I did what European or Italian editors would do. I mean, I compared went over all the translations myself. So ultimately, there was my translation brain overseeing all of the translations. In the case of If This Is a Man, actually, it was a complicated rights situation, and we couldn't get the English rights, the English translation, the English rights to retranslate it. But Stuart Wolf, the original translator, agreed to he had always wanted to revise his translation, and so this gave him an opportunity to do that. So it also became, part of the whole project.
Hi. I'm just wondering, translation is often perhaps solely described using very tortured and mournful language, words like betrayal, curse, loss.
Yeah.
I'm wondering why you think that might be.
Why? Oh, why? Because it's the easiest way to account for failures, I guess. No, because it's very difficult, because you can never have something that's exactly the same. I mean, you can never, it can't be, by definition. And maybe that's not the goal. I don't know. But that might be a more philosophical question than I can answer. But I do think it's because it's so hard because there's so many elements involved in each aspect of it, in every word, as I was trying to say that, that there's no, I mean, there's also positive words. I mean, you do get these books that you would never have, but there's such a lot of work going into it. I guess you always feel that you've lost something, or you've made the wrong decision, or that other word would have been better. So, I don't know, maybe somebody else has something more profound to say.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm still floored that you were able to tackle reading the Divine Comedy after studying Italian for just 1 year. So I'm wondering both, how long did it take you to really develop confidence in your level of Italian to translate anything? And also, because you spend so much time, I imagine, thinking about the difference in relationship between English and Italian, what do you think do you have a preference between the languages at this point, or do you think a language has strengths or weaknesses over the other?
Well, naturally, I think that Italian is the most beautiful, perfect language in the world. But, but English has its strengths. It's hard to say about in terms of confidence. I mean, I still feel like that I don't know Italian well enough, really. But I study it very hard when I mean, every translation is like studying the language, really, all over again. And when when you're translating, you really do end up. I actually know a German translator who said that one of his authors, I can't remember who it was, said, "You are going to read my work more carefully and more closely than anyone else in the world, even than me." I mean, so I think that's really what it comes to, that you're really just studying every sentence of the writer's work. And if you have, I mean, I guess as a copy editor, is to go back to that, you're sort of, I mean, it works both ways. I mean, learning another language, as somebody said earlier, is a way of learning your own language, but knowing your own language from a kind of analytical viewpoint is really helpful as a translator in understanding the other language.
Great, thank you. So this is maybe more a comment than a question, but as you were discussing the retranslation of Primo Levi, and the desire to create a kind of single voice throughout the other, I was reminded of, in fact, the exact opposite move that was started by Penguin Books to retranslate Freud by different authors.
That. Yeah.
And I mean, I read a lot of Freud in both languages, and the new translation was it gave me enormous anxiety because it was so difficult to find the voices were so many, right? So so it was a deliberate choice to translate each piece by a different translator.
Why do you think that was?
I think in order to defamiliarize the experience of the text.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Oh, yes. They did the same with Proust.
Okay.
So this is a question translators probably don't like to answer, but I'm going to ask it. Have you ever reached a moment where you are at a complete and total impasse and you are willing to sort of declare that you simply do not know what an author is trying to say? And I ask that question because I'm thinking of my own experience. You mentioned Primo Levi's invention of words, and there's an author I was translating, a Brazilian author, and she invents words, neologisms, and I would ask Brazilian, native speakers of Portuguese what she was saying, and sometimes they would say, "I have no idea."
Yeah.
And so I didn't want to just leave blanks in the text, but I'm always curious about that. What you do when you simply do not know what to do. How do you work yourself out?
I walk around the house. Yeah, I do a lot of walking around. No, I mean, there's a lot of ways you can solve. I mean, you can ask, as you say, you can ask a lot of people, ask more than one person, several people, if they have any idea. You can leave it, just leave the word in the original language and try to explain it. I mean, with Levi, a lot of times I did leave it, like this word Knall, where I just left it. I mean, there was really nothing to do with it. Whereas something like the other example that I gave, dysphilasi, you could put into, make it into the Latin or Greek word in English. But I don't know. I mean, it's true. I mean, and you could leave it out. So I guess I don't really have a good solution.
Thanks so much for your talk and for your beautiful translations. I'll out myself. I'm a translator of poetry, so I routinely traffic in the impossible.
Yes.
And I like it that way. But I had a question that sort of follows John's, which is, I noticed that in many of your examples, and also in your work, which I've read, of course, you tend to make in-text explanations, or that seems to be, at least from this talk, your preference.
It is.
I'm curious about, and maybe this is also the difference between publishing translations of experimental poetry with tiny independent presses versus the kind of publishing and translating you're doing. But I'm curious about the choice not to include some of those snag moments or moments of impossibility that John was asking you about as part of a translator's note, to really expose some of those difficulties.
Well, you could. I mean, that's true. You could. And I have done that a few times. In the levy, there's a few places where that was done. But I guess I have this feeling, and I've become less hardline about it. I mean, I used to feel very strongly that if you're reading a novel, you don't want to be stopped by footnotes. But I don't know, maybe you do. I mean, maybe you want to know what's going on. I mean, for things that you don't know. Endnotes are another solution, of course. But
I was actually thinking
of
an essay.
An essay, yeah, no, I know what there's that too. But most, I don't know, I guess that's something that could be done. I mean, I did a little bit of that in the introduction to the Primo Levi. But I guess most of the books that I translate are not, they're books, they're not books where the publisher wants to have a introduction. Or maybe they would, I don't know. Anyway, I don't have a good answer.
Hi.
Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to young and aspiring translators in the room?
Well, mostly, as I was saying earlier to Stine, you should have a day job. You cannot support yourself as a translator. I mean, things are getting better, and I have to say that thanks to Elena Ferrante, I think that the role of the translator has become more seen, more vivid. So people do tend to realize that there is a translator involved in bringing you this book, but it's very hard to make a living. I think William Weaver was one of the few great Italian translator who was one of the few translators who actually made a living as a translator.
Because he translated
everything. It's true. Yes, he had a lot of good stuff to choose from. But I would say, that trying, persisting. There's a lot of online places that publish like pieces of translations, and getting stuff published online that, like Words Without Borders, Asymptote. There's a whole bunch of other places that publish, and then these smaller publishing houses that are publishing a lot of translations. So that's not a lot. There's also a lot more, I guess, translation workshops. There's those PEN Heim grants for translations in process. So PEN has a lot of resources. I don't know if that's helpful, but it's something.
Well, you could also take courses in Italian if you want to.
Yeah. Actually, Susan, the translator, German translator Susan Bernofsky, has a blog called Translationista, and there's a post on her blog from a couple of years ago, which is advice to young translators. So anyway, thank you.
If there are no more questions, why don't we thank.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.